researchers are accurately performing some human mind reading.
It's looking a lot more like AI is capable of reading our thoughts.
As of this year, AI can successfully interpret what you're thinking about by simply reading your brainwaves. With technologies like Elon Musk's Neuralink, which was successfully inserted into the first human brain in history just 5 weeks ago, the accuracy at which AI will be able to read your thoughts is about to multiply by 100. Now, while this is going to lead to some absolutely mind-blowing developments in the realms of medicine, research, and gaming, this poses a massive threat to the privacy of your own thoughts. Because for the first time in human history, someone thousands of miles away with the right equipment can not only know exactly what you're thinking about, but potentially even be able to predict what you're going to think next. Could our future potentially be leading us towards a decline in the US as Neuralink takes away your last bit of privacy? Joining me to discuss this today is Uber Boyo, an Irish YouTuber who is deeply entrenched into the study of AI and who is someone I can probably entirely credit with helping me find meaning during the darkest period of my life. Uber Boyo, thanks so much for joining us today.
Mr. Anti.Prophet, thank you very much for having me. I hope you're well.
This conversation has been a bitch in the making. This is probably the fourth or fifth tech error that we've had when trying to get together. So I'm glad to finally get you on the program. And with that, our first question from the intro that we just saw, are we headed towards a future where Minority Report could potentially become a reality?
Well, I'd say this is the reason why we're having such difficulty getting this up and running is that there must be some type of operation happen. There's some guy outside the house right now with a ray beam blasting stuff in, screwing everything up. But I guess that is to lead into the idea that the future is already here. The idea that the Minority Report situation, which is where the government can read your mind, it can penetrate into your consciousness, that is in some sense already here. It's not some esoteric thing that's far off. People are well aware of this as it is. This phone can already predict your thoughts. It can already predict what you want. Now, of course, it's primitive. It's not that sophisticated, but everybody has had the experience. Now, I don't believe in such crazy conspiracy theories, but everybody has had the experience where they go into Instagram and they were just talking to their friend about, throwing a shoe out the window. And then they go into Instagram and it's like, oh my God, what the hell? They're giving me ads for new shoes. How is this happening? And this is, of course, because these things are collecting data, allegedly, and reorganizing that stuff into very interesting algorithms that are able to associate consumer behavior. Now, the scary thing about something like perhaps Neuralink or these various technological tools is that they can go a layer deeper. They can, control our minds, people say. And we've already taken steps towards this. We're already on this path. So, for example, there was studies done, and I think you may have shown that video already to the audience, of people who had just electrodes put on their skull that took their brain waves that came through their skull, I believe. So the electricity passed through their skull and was able to recreate audio. So they played them Pink Floyd, and the AI was able to decode the brain waves of the people listening to Pink Floyd and spit out basically a mumbled version of Pink Floyd. So what you see is you go from like a very maybe broad general ability to read your mind, which is like what type of consumer products you want, to a very much more specific one, which is that it's able to read the patterns in your brain and articulate out for you what you're actually doing. And that's happened. That's already, that's been done. That's real. That's here already. So that can be done. Now, the next step after this, of course, is Elon Musk is drilling a hole in your skull in order to get direct access to your brainwaves. So not just coming through your skull because of electrodes, but now it's drilling a hole and putting a load of wires into your brain. So the electricity that's going through your brain when you sense things, it goes straight into a machine. So this is going to increase the resolution. So the black pill is that our minds are already getting read by technology, and it's just about the depth of the penetration. And so these new technologies, as freaky as they are just about going one step further than we've already gone. And that can lead to all sorts of problems. Like there's privacy issues, of course. Oh my God, letting a technology company drill a hole in your brain and put information in your head that could affect your consciousness, that's very dodgy. You know how much trouble we've had with like Facebook and data collection with these things. what happens when that thing is going in and it's able to manipulate your dreams? These are all very big questions. So it's a good question, my man, and I think there's a lot to preordain coming around in the future.
I'm glad you touched on the privacy element of sort of what's going on, because I think a big question is, what do AI developments like this mean for governments who center their laws around privacy? For example, what happens to the Fourth and Fifth Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, which essentially protects against unreasonable search and seizure as well as self-incrimination once technology like this is widely available?
Yeah, this is very interesting how like regulation and law comes in, because one of the constant patterns you see with new technology that's only, I guess, about 200 years old, but is something that you do see, is that there tends to be a Wild West moment where all this stuff bursts out and a lot of people make a lot of money, a lot of people create some crazy innovations, and then there's a crackdown afterwards, you know? So crypto is one that you could see here. There was this huge explosion. Everybody was making loads of cash with crypto. Everybody was losing loads of cash with crypto. All these new ideas are getting flung around. And then certain big institutions were established, like Ethereum, like Bitcoin, like Solana. And now they've kind of turned into juggernauts. And now what's happening at the moment is all the financial system is coming in, and it's threatening regulations. Like a lot of these guys who are in crypto are trying to prepare their protocols for regulations so that they don't get wiped out. And you see that sort of gradual movement in this direction towards regulation, which is sort of when it becomes official. And a lot of people don't like this, by the way. Like, a lot of people think governments kill off technology sectors by doing this, which is sort of true in a way. But you see this pattern. So what you would expect with this is that you're going to have something like Neuralink, we'll say. It's very much like social media. Social media, email, all this appeared, 20 years ago, and it was very free. The internet was very open, very free. And then as the internet progressed forward, specifically social media, people started to flex their freedom of speech a little bit more. So what happens? Censorship comes in, and this is a very famous problem that a lot of people are having. So there's like radical, intense censorship. So with Neuralink, we're probably going to see a similar pattern where this thing will come out. Nobody will have any idea what it is or what it's capable of doing. There will be a bit of a Wild West moment for a while, I'd imagine. Although, like, you never know. Maybe they'll come in with regulations straight away because it's a medical procedure. But maybe there'll be a Wild West moment, and then there'll be some, like, kind of crackdowns, and it will be some harsh laws that certain companies can't use data, because we don't even know the type of data we're getting, Like, I guess I should have led with that, but what type of information are you getting that you can sell to people? Like, how is that going to work? So it's going to take a couple of years for people to figure that out, and then when they do, I'd say the government might come in with regulations, and the EU will do stuff and all these type of things. But off the bat, we're going into weird times. We have a lot of different institutions that are pushing in different directions for this stuff. You have somebody like Elon Musk, for example, who is promoting privacy, at least on the surface. So perhaps him and his company will build its reputation off this privacy first. And that's actually a very interesting thing, is that it might become a private thing that pushes this, because that will win customer support. Or maybe it will be the government comes in and puts really, really firm, harsh lockdowns on how people use these tools, maybe even regulating them into the ground and restricting them. I could see a possible future that way, where it's like you can only get this if you're disabled or something like this.
Well, then, in that case, what about governments who openly devalue privacy, like Russia and China? And, I'm not going to ask you to recount the nuances of geopolitics inside of Russia or China, but theoretically, if a country was unrestrained by ethics and privacy rights, how far could they theoretically take things like this technology?
That's a good question, yes. I guess just to briefly touch into geopolitics one, because this is interesting. These technologies tend to manifest and develop like certain styles depending on the geopolitical block they're in. So, for example, TikTok is very much like Instagram and very much like Twitter. It's, a social media app designed to get you addicted to looking at content. But it does have its sort of own style, its own sort of character. And even like in some sense, although not completely, but in some sense, it's it's more uncensored in certain directions than others. Like for example, in the West, you can actually put up like a lot of naked bodies and stuff like that. But something with TikTok that's awful annoying is that even if you put up a statue of a naked body, TikTok will pull it down. So there's there is this sort of multipolar balance between these. You have like Chinese tech. Maybe you could look at Russian Telegram perhaps as their tech, although that's not really correct because the Russians, Telegram does not really agree with the Russian state. But you see the fact that there's a diversity of blocks of technological superpowers, powers that can become cradles for this technology that actually give you options. And so there might be a kind of quasi balance there that could be interesting. But in terms of maybe the idea of China using like an unregulated version of this, I think this is more of a thought experiment because in reality, I don't know, would they be like that at all? We in the West tend to scapegoat the other, I guess you could say. But maybe they would. Maybe they go crazy and say to themselves, all right, well, we want to compete. Actually, this is an anxiety I notice among a lot of the big top AI tech guys, is that they're worried that China will be not held back by the restrictions and regulations of the West going through their sort of moral purity spiral with the woke stuff at the moment. And so while the West becomes anti-competitive because they're focused on, hiring people on all sorts of crazy ideological grounds instead of like just pure merit, the West becomes anti-competitive. China blasts forward because China is just like a hyper-organized, almost like an authoritarian state, and just says, you go and try make artificial general intelligence as fast as you possibly can. And like, we don't care how many people you hurt in order to do this, drill holes in everybody. If that's the case, that could go absolutely crazy. And like the way that like an authoritarian country like that would work is that they would have no concern for the individual. It would be like a mad scientist type thing. It's like line them up, make a factory, pull all these delinquents off the street, all the homeless people, put them in some factory or something like this, and it's just drilling holes in them all and trying to blast this Neuralink thing forward as fast as they possibly can to get it working, if they assumed it's an appropriate goal. So I could definitely see something like that happen. And it probably does happen to an extent as well, But we also have to wonder their goals. Like, I think the East is more interested in pursuing artificial intelligence, for what I see, and they will probably wait and see if Neuralink is that big of a deal, and then if it is, they might invest very heavily in getting it done. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's some of my thoughts on that.
Whenever anyone thinks about new technologies being used to oppress people, most people immediately think of a world resembling 1984, where the government surveils your every move and bludgeons you into submission, etc. But more and more, it's seeming like, at least in the West, we're moving towards something resembling more of Huxley's Brave New World, where technology is used to pacify us. But it seems to be coming more from corporations rather than governments. In your mind, is pacification preferable to brutal 1984-esque control?
So I have somewhat of an individualist stance on this. I'm going to sound like a shill for the government here, or the powers to be, if you so will. But the powers, the authoritarian powers, are in some sense pushing these tools into our lives to some extent. For a variety of different reasons. One of them might be just sheer profit. Maybe there's we can get into the conspiracy theories, but there's some type of there's this line of thinking called cybernetics that came actually out of Aldous Huxley's Circles, which is very fascinating. And it's basically systems thinking, if you want to think about it this way. And they were wondering how they could create like information systems and use information systems in order to guide minds and control minds and stuff like this. So that was actually a thing, and that led to the genesis of the internet. The internet was emerged out of cybernetics, so it's pretty cool. But there is also an aspect of it where we aren't victims, This is very much our Christian Carl Jung sort of idea here. It's that like we do always have authority over our own souls, and this is an enormous trend you see with social media. There's lots of people who are like, how to control your focus with this. A lot of people even say get off social media and don't use it, and there might be wisdom in that. Like, a lot of people use social media successfully and become wealthy and do incredible things with it, so there is a benefit to this tool. But a lot of people just doom scroll and waste their lives and spend countless hours burying themselves into social media. And it seems like it comes down to just like a problem of addiction, a problem of it's almost like a vice. It's like a new vice. It's like gambling or alcoholism manifests as a new thing, like social media doom scrolling, social media addiction or something like this. And like this is the eternal understanding that in some sense that is our responsibility. On some level, we should be trying to take responsibility for that, because if your government's going to come in and try to fix your vices, you're opening up a big can of worms there. You know, like it's like you got to be careful with that stuff. Certainly, the government maybe should regulate people who are doling out these vices. But the citizens also want to try to take some responsibility, because if they don't, someone's going to come in and do it for them. So there is an aspect where we kind of have to stand up to this. And I think mankind has been pushing towards this quite a lot. Like the West does have lots of creators, lots of people who talk about social media health, our relationship with social media. In fact, I think this is one of the biggest developments, is that this technology is so new that a lot of people are kind of saying to themselves, like, how do we deal with this? How do we create a phone-life balance? Like, that's a big deal. I saw somebody talk about how the fertility rates and divorces and relationships and like this, sexual relationships, the phones are an enormous problem with this. The more people are on the internet and on the phones, the less they're having sex, the less they're meeting people, the less they're having a relationship. They might, for example, have a lot of Tinder flings, but it's actually less sex overall, less relationship. And it's like you're starting to see this weird effect that this technology is having on life itself. And that's something that people kind of have to move with. So yeah, like it's what force is driving this. You could definitely see negative characters, like maybe this, for example, Facebook figures out the dopamine spiral, and so this is a corporation exploiting a population in order to get their attention off them. And it might be nice to have a government to come in and regulate this in some sense and guide it. But it just hasn't played out this way, Like the way the West has decided to operate itself is that we want to be very liberal in the pillars of our thought. Even if we're right wing, most people still want to be liberal. We want to be left alone type thing, and we want to experiment and be free. And that's just the direction we've gone. So we kind of have to match up with the individual strength in order to compete with this. And I think that's the situation that we're in. But we're certainly vulnerable to people who would exploit us, and it would be very intelligent that people are aware of this and ready to take action against that as well. Like there's nothing wrong with getting organized and stopping someone from exploiting you. Stopping Edward Bernays from fleecing you is not something that is dishonorable.
Well, I think it's interesting that you immediately go to individual strength, because something you post a lot about on your YouTube channel is Nietzsche. And Nietzsche has this idea of the last man, right? Basically, the coddled weakling of civilization. And in my mind, Nietzsche, if he had to choose between brutal suppression via technology by the government or endless coddling and pacification by a government through technology, he would prefer almost the former, as it would at least spark people into action to resist, because nobody likes being brutally oppressed.
So this is interesting. I've actually found a lot of different thinkers riff off this. There's a famous guy called Kalergi, who's like he's famous in a lot of different circles for a lot of different reasons. But he was very much a Nietzschean. And Nietzsche was talking about the next 200 years after his time. Nietzsche was saying, like, we're entering into the period of nihilism, which is going to be this chaotic, crazy time. And because Nietzsche has a sort of like cycle of civilization notion. So Rome rises, and Rome is full of strong, masculine men, very powerful, full of will to power. And then Rome reaches its apex, its empire, and it develops the peace, the great Roman peace, Pax Romana. And then what happens is all this success eventually leads to this end of the civilizational will. And that last step is this explosion in culture, actually. So like at the very, very end, as the physical body is sort of like letting out its last gasp, if you want to think about this, or its last hurrah, its last explosion. It releases all its incredible culture, and a lot of revolutions and crazy things can happen. So Christianity, for example, rises up in Rome, which is one of the most significant events in human history. And so when you look at like what Nietzsche might think, would he, looking at our situation there, you're talking about that brutal oppression. Maybe he would prefer something like the opportunity for people to get destroyed by their vices, because there's a sort of like challenge. We're going into an end game. The decline is happening, and those who have the strength, the pessimistic strength, to actually play the game well through the decline and come out on the other end in a position of strength will actually be the winners. So Nietzsche might sort of say, let the whole game fall apart. Let everything go, like, welcome the chaos, welcome the degeneracy, welcome the madness, and we'll try play our way through it. And I brought up Kalergi because Kalergi says the very same thing. He says that there's going to be this huge globalized blending and mixing of all cultures. Globalization is going to reduce time and space into nothing, and the West is going to get like meat churned. And there's going to be, he even talks about this idea that there'll be a free love experience where everybody will start to marry and maybe even just like have sex and stuff like this without discretion anymore. And so he encourages, like, it's so weird because he says all this and people would be like 1960 hippies and all this. But then he says it'd be very important that the future aristocracy is prudent in their marriage choices and avoids getting dragged down into this Dionysian kind of flesh hell, you know, this type of thing. And like, you know, get all confused and lose their identity and get turned into the hodgepodge underclass type thing. Now, that's a very interesting idea to think about. And he says, no, in order for us to win, we have to try to maintain our coherency through this. And then in about 250 years or 200 years, the people, the mob will literally have spent itself, and it will just be a mess, and it will be basically ripe for being ruled by somebody else. And that's a very crazy idea, but that's sort of in alignment with what maybe Nietzsche would have thought. Now, that's, you know, very pessimistic, very pro-nihilism, pro-degeneracy type thing, if you will, pro-chaos. But I could have seen him taking this direction.
What's up, guys? Just a quick break in the video. As I said in the intro, Uberboyo is someone who I can almost entirely credit with getting me through the darkest period of my life possible. I cannot overstate how much I love this guy's YouTube channel, so please go over there and check it out when you get the chance. And on top of that, this is a guy who really demonstrated to me what it meant to be a good storyteller, especially in the setting of long form content. And he's someone that I've worked with on and off over the course of the last year, and I cannot highly recommend him enough. This is not a paid shout out or anything like that. This guy is just a homie, and he is just that good at what he does. So if you've ever wanted to become a better storyteller and you want to work one-on-one with something, I highly recommend you checking him out by just hopping over to his YouTube page and getting into contact with him there. Again, not a paid shout out. He's just a G. All right, back to the video.
Something else you delve into quite a bit on your channel is the work of Carl Jung. And one of Jung's huge areas of study was the study of the pagan ages, the age of Aquarius, the age of Aries, etc. And something that seems to be the case now is that we're entering a new age similar to how the Romans entered the new age of Christianity around 2,000 years ago, which ended up literally resulting in the rise of a new god that basically took over the world. And I guess my question is, would Jung think we're headed into a new age, and would he think that AI is in some ways our new God, and that Neuralink is almost our new holiest of holies in Solomon's temple, where we pray and communicate with that God?
It's a great question, and it's again, I'm going to tirade a little bit here, so I hope you're
Sure.
comfortable. But sort of related to the last question, this is the kind of meta notion here is the idea between progress and decline, I guess you could say. And the idea is, like, is progress possible, or are we trapped in this sort of cyclical history where we always get pulled back down to reality and we can't really escape history at all, and there's no real progress? So this would actually be a true pagan perspective, like the Kali Yuga and stuff like this. We don't progress. There's no higher technological society. We're not reaching towards some teleological end. There's not some completion of life. None of that stuff's happening. We are actually just caught up in a delusion, and it's eventually going to pop and we're going to sink back down. So to give you an example of this type of thinking, think about like Spengler's decline, or the idea of what happened in Rome. You know, Rome rises up and it grows into this enormous empire, and then eventually balance comes around and pulls it back down. Like we were saying, you know, there's this age of degeneracy, and then out of that rises a new aristocracy. Now, your thinking there might be that, okay, well, this decline is going to happen, we've gone in the West and we've gotten delusional, we've gotten out of touch with nature, we've gone off into all this nonsense, we're spending all this time trying to build AI and all this, and it's just destroying us as we're trying to do this, like annihilating us completely. And what has to happen is it has to, like, everything that goes up has to come down. This has to stop at some point. This has to crash. The decline has to come in. The end of the Roman Empire has to be around the corner. So the only thing you should really do is prepare to be the Goths, prepare to be the big bad boys who take over when the game is done. And there's certainly wisdom into thinking this way. The return to the natural order of things, which is obviously the might is right, the military rule, that type of thing. The return of that power. That's what's coming back. And so maybe that's the thing that people need to wake up from, is that, like, all this stuff that we're seeing in technological society is a delusion. And Ted Kaczynski was right type thing. You need to go back to original power and secure things this way. And you're basically waiting it out until that happens. Now, that's quite a damning prophecy, but I think it's important to understand that one, because this is what makes Jung's idea so radical. Because Jung is actually suggesting a genuine progress. Like, progress is used by, I guess you could say, the mob, the mainstream, or maybe like an awful lot of delusional people philosophically in certain parts of the world, and they ignore the possibility that we could get pulled back to a brutal return to nature, where order and principles and reality is shoved back in our face in a horrific way, and then for 1,000 years we're driven into a natural order. Like, that could happen. And a lot of them are in denial about that, and they want to insult people and insult tradition and insult past this. Jung is not in denial of that. Jung is very good at integrating the past, engorging himself in the past. He was very, full man, if you want to put it in this terms. But he does have a conception of progress. He is, in some sense, pushing forward this notion of progress. And this notion of progress was about eras. And it's really to do with our psychology, really to do with our minds. And so the era from over 2,000 years ago was, in some sense, the Roman era, we could say, or the might is right era, if you want to say it this way, the Aries era in the astrological charts. And this was where power was based on strength. And the way people thought, the way people morally valued things, was based on the categories of nature. And what does nature present to us? The strongest always wins. The lion is good because the lion is powerful. There is no law to protect the gazelle. The gazelle gets murdered and eaten by the lion, and the lion's strength enhances. The life that the lion lives is one of kingship, it's one of royalty. It kills and it sleeps all day, and it kills and it grows and it expands and becomes the best. And so the sort of moral orientation, the way you should conduct yourself in the world, is to be like the lion, to become strong and to become the top dog. And if you are destroyed by the lion, if you lose, or if you're not the lion, well, you should know your place in the jungle, know your position in the hierarchy, and have this sort of understanding of thyself. So there's this emergent morality that comes in. This is very much like Nietzsche as well, the reevaluation of all morals. You go before Christianity, and you have this way of thinking. He looks through the psychology of how these people spoke to each other, and he sees that they have this completely different moral conception that's based on might is right, instead of this notion of, be nice to each other, I guess you could say. And what happens then in Rome is obviously a collapse, but more specifically, ignoring the political stuff, there's a enormous transformation in how people's minds work. And we are inducted with a psychological story of the world, or a story of the world that's based on a conscience. We actually get, I guess you could say, abstract morality drilled into our heads. We become much, much more moral. We are forced to we would actually strictly call this forced to idealize. We are forced to, by the story of Christ, we are forced to confront things like shame and guilt. We are forced to confront the doubt in our own nature. That's really what happens with Christianity. And we are forced to look and say that instincts inside of us that make us like the lion, they actually cause suffering in the world. They cause us to murder this poor innocent slave on the cross and torture him. And there's nothing honorable about that. There's nothing, like, if you just look at what happened to Jesus, it's like you're looking at the gazelle and you're realizing that it's disgusting, like why he's an innocent man with a noble soul, he's God himself, and we just tore his skin off and tortured him because we're just ugly, savage beasts. And when you look at something like, for example, Passion of the Christ, you see You know, those guys, the Romans who are whipping them, they're monsters. They're ugly. They're crude men. They're thugs, and they've got this like darkness inside of them because they're you know, they can't handle their life, and so they take it out on this innocent man. And then, of course, the Pharisees are just as bad. You know, they have this horrific dark energy inside of them that they want to see him tortured, and they're like, crucify him. And then you have noble punches by all this. So what you see is the exposition of the negativity of mankind, of this whole might is right conception. It gets proven wrong, or it gets exposed as ugly. And then Christianity becomes the moral era. And so all throughout Christianity, we're wrestling with our conscience. We're wrestling with our idealism, wrestling with what is right. And this actually leads to some very interesting situations. So, for example, really brutal things like slavery, you know. The Romans built their entire, like, because slavery is natural. Slavery is how the lion kills the gazelle, the man enslaves the other man, so that the Roman can become powerful. Slavery is a method for you to overcome the world. And these Christians would be idealistically against slavery. And what's interesting is that may seem crazy. It's like, why would you go against nature like that? Why don't you just embrace slavery and be base? Stop being a cooked Christ cook or something like this, and understand that slavery's base. Slavery is what makes you powerful. You know, why have a conscience? Why not be a Nietzschean master and all this? But slavery is what destroyed Rome. This is very fascinating when you think about it. Slavery is what took Rome and drilled it into the ground. It was their master morality that annihilated them. And what I mean by this is that Rome rose up, became powerful, and started to gather in all these slaves from all across his empire. And about, like, maybe after 500 years of doing this, by conquering all these people and bringing them in and making them work, because aristocrats don't work, you know, it's not noble to labor. The Romans had entirely replaced their own population. Like, Julius Caesar rose up because there were so many Romans getting replaced by slavery that the veterans were coming home and finding that they couldn't work in their farms anymore because it was just slave plantations ran by the aristocrats. And they go into the cities and find themselves all in ghettos alongside slaves because labor had been driven down because there's so many slaves. And Julius Caesar comes in and sees all these native Romans, these soldiers who fought abroad, exploited. And he was like, guys, I'll represent you, and I'm going to go and we're going to take the power off these guys. And he took on the aristocracy. So the morality of these Roman aristocrats, the might is right lions of the past, actually replaced their own population. And by the end of Rome, the entire native Roman population had been basically replaced. The aristocracy had fallen apart. Their political operation had fallen apart. And their religion had been transformed. So their gods had been killed in some sense. And it's like, it was almost like this incredible awakening to, like, this mode of operation destroys you. And so Christianity idealistically pushes against this. So it seems cooked. It seems weird. It's not like it's, you know, you moral faggot, you know, excuse my language, excuse my French. You hear words like this on the internet. But it seems silly, but it actually might have allowed the West to avoid that problem, which is this idea of, like, you know, creating slave states. Because Europe, I know America and the colonies are a bit different, but Europe never became a slave state. It always separated itself from that. And that's again, very, very interesting to think about. Spain banned slavery very early on. Basically, as soon as they conquered the Americas, they banished slavery. And that was a big deal. England also banished slavery as well. This is all very, very unique. And this moral idealism also led to other things. It's such a subtle thing, which is so interesting. It led then to the Europeans having to do labor themselves because they can't take in slaves like a Roman aristocrat. They're forced to work, you know, the Protestant work ethic. And aristocrats in Europe kind of have to do a bit more work than the old Roman aristocrats. They can't sit under laurels like they could. They have no slaves to do stuff like this. And this is where we actually see stuff like technology become so significant, because then these Europeans want to create machines. They want to create weapons. They want to create, like, factories. They want to create systems, railroads. And so that forces them, because they don't have slave labor, they're forced to try to create machine labor. And that's actually what allows us to industrialize and become a civilization that's more powerful than Rome. So we take over the world because of our idealism, because of this weird creative restriction that we have. We actually become more powerful than Rome themselves. That's very fascinating. Because we don't compromise our morals, we actually gain greater strength in the long term. Big idea. And Rome could have done that. Rome had a steam engine, but they never turned it into a steam factory or a steam machine. because there was no incentive. They had slaves. They didn't need to be inventive, you know. And it's so fascinating that lack of morality feels powerful, but it actually has these sort of restrictions. So Christianity, for this conscience that we had, for whatever it did, transformed us significantly. Now, this is very much Jung's idea of the ions. As we move through the ions, we go through these very, very important psychological things. These psychological thoughts about the conscience lead to these enormous civilizational situations where we have the industrialized technological, idealistic West that we're in now. Now, it seems like we're moving into a new one at the moment, because what do you see happening? Actually, out of that trend, because remember, out of Rome came Christianity, out of that trend in the West, which is to produce technology, what do you see happen? You see us start to create technology, and eventually this technology starts to integrate with our minds. And now we're starting to develop a new psychology, a new way that we operate with ourselves. We don't think with our minds and our conscience anymore by ourselves. Technology thinks alongside of us. Like whatever has happened in the last 30 years, we've gone through a significant psychological transformation. And we've already spoke about this. You know, we've got to the point where these phones are having effects on our sexuality, effects on our lives. You're seeing all sorts of crazy mass movements happen because of technology, because of this. So technology is having a big effect on our psychology. It's almost like a new part of our brain. And we're getting to the point now with Neuralink where it's drilling holes in our head and going in and starting to get direct access to our brains. And so this is is this the new era? It's come out of Christianity. It's come out of this sort of moral conscience, and it's now the technological conscience. And if Jung was correct, and Jung's pointing out that we're progressing through history like this, going through these 2,000-year eras, and you know we went from the pagan one and now we went to the Christian one, and it seems like we might be reaching towards into the age of Aquarius now, which is the technological one where we'll have Neuralinks, we'll have machines integrated with ourselves, and we'll have artificial intelligence, you know, operating within our brain. We'll expand our brains in some sense. That could be a possibility. That's a very interesting idea. I don't think I've heard anybody else say as well. And it's in Jung's Ion, and he lays it out quite interestingly. Maybe not in the modern details, but he lays out the framework for it. So that was a bit of a tirade, but I'll leave it there.
Well, I think the last question that I wanted to ask was around this book by the name of Influence, which is written by Dr. Robert Cialdini. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because it's considered one of the great marketing books, because it shows you how companies and advertising agencies essentially hijack your lower reptilian brain into buying their products without you even knowing it. But the fascinating thing about this book is that it was primarily written to inform consumers how they were being manipulated by companies so that they could develop defense mechanisms to protect themselves from advertisers. And what I wanted to ask going into this interview is, are there any resources for people to learn how to essentially inoculate their minds from AI and pacification via AI and technology in general, or maybe related to what it was that we just talked about? Are we just inherently heading into a new era, and this is our Roman moment, and we're past the point of no return, and there's no way to really inoculate ourselves from technology at all?
So I certainly think I think inoculate is a very loaded term. I'm calling you out here. You know, inoculate is sort of suggesting that it's a disease that we need a vaccine against or something like this. I think it might be better to understand it's like a question of adaptation. You know, like World War I, the arrival of artillery and tanks and airplanes, it was tough, but eventually people had to adapt to it and figure out tactics that worked, and eventually they did, you know. And it was very anti-human, but there was still heroes in it, you know. There's people like Ernst Jünger, for example, a heroic man who fought in World War One. There was all of the soldiers would say that the guys fighting in fighter planes, the Air Force, they always saw that as a very heroic way of fighting, because these guys would be shooting each other and stuff like this, and it was very interesting. It was much less draggish than the trenches. So there's always a sort of aspect of adaptation. And what I see with technology is actually this stuff precisely going on. There's very interesting implications here. So take, for example, this is very Jungian again. It's almost like an active archetype. Take, for example, the binary of the Zoomer gym bro addicted to steroids, and the kind of Zoomer, I guess you could say, person who goes into college and gets convinced that they need to change their gender using like steroids, using the same thing. Now, what's fascinating is that these two people are way more similar than we might think psychologically, because the Zoomer goes on this and he sees some other dude on steroids and he's got this like fucking massive physique. He's absolutely huge. And the Zoomer sees in his head this vision, this ideal of what he should be. And he's like, it's like related even to his gender, you know, it's like, am I enough of a man? That's the image of a real man, and I'm this skinny little dweeb, you know? So I want to transform into that person. And in order for me to transform into that person, I need to accelerate towards this. And I can't do it myself, so I need to use technology to help me. Now, of course, this technology is pharmaceutical technology. So what we have is a media, information, installing an image inside somebody's head and giving them an ideal, and then them using technology in order to transform themselves to reach this ideal, and perhaps seriously damaging their organs and things like this, you know, like especially if they do it imprudently and for a long time. Now, how different is this than somebody who goes in and goes onto TikTok with this and maybe falls into a different circle and starts to get this information that, you know, you were born, you know, this part of your mind that idealizes can select a different identity. And the biological identity you get is not the same as the one that you idealize. And so, you know, somebody might say, all right, I'm somebody else. I'm a different gender or something like this. And then they go and they'll take the exact same technology, the exact same medical tools that the Zoomer would, and they'll inject this stuff. You know, they'll go in and they'll inject this stuff and transform themselves to suit the image inside of their head. And so what we're seeing there is that, like, these technologies altogether are imposing themselves upon our lives, and they have effects upon us. And people actually just fall victim to them in various different ways. And in some sense, like, you just have to sort of say, is this the kind of world that we're going into? Are these people, like the Zoomer and the gender reassignment, like, are these people just instances of flashes in the pans of what is going to start to be possible? Like, is that the sort of first impression we're seeing of popular common day usage of transhumanism, of people now using technology to significantly modulate what they are? And is that the direction we're going to start to go? This is like very much like the Greek myth of Daedalus or something like this. So I think that's a critical thing to understand, is that we're going to adapt to technology. Technology is already imposing ideals and images upon ourselves. It's a very holistic thing. It goes all the way into psychology. It almost always comes back to psychology. Like, why does the Zoomer make the choice to take Trenbolone or something like this? He makes this because he's got an image inside of his head, a projection inside of his head about how he should look. Now, if he had psychological capacity to understand that image is not something that should tyrannize him, maybe he wouldn't need to take the gear. Maybe he should take the gear. I don't know. Like, you know, it's a hard call, but you kind of have to wonder. It's like, is that how do you get people to start thinking in that more savvy way? As I said earlier, there's also the kind of question of the psychology of life and death. This is very Nietzschean, you know, the life-denying nature of these technologies. You get sucked into online circles. They're very negative. They've got a very bleak and pessimistic outlook towards life, and you get involved with these circles, and you end up not achieving the basic principles of life, which is, you know, establishing a career, developing skills that are useful to the world, being fertile. You know, getting involved with brotherhoods and creating positions of power for yourself and your nations. Like, you don't do any of this stuff because you're off making memes or something like this, or you know, you're running in the wrong direction. So there's this sort of adaptation that a lot of people have to technology, and I think a lot of people are failing as a consequence, and so they're ending up sterile. A lot of people are ending up like sexless. The incels are coming. A lot of you know, like, big problem with both men and women is that everyone has all these like very sort of mercenary relationships, which ends up scarring basically both genders, as most people are seeing. And so people reach like their mid-30s and they're messes. You know, they're an absolute mess. They've had way too many partners that scarred their conception of romance, and it's just like a lot of things are getting destroyed because of technology, because of the way that it affects us. And so it is a sort of a perpetual thing where you need to develop this sort of psychological savvy, this criticism, this self-conception, and be able then to like judge your behaviors and stuff like this, and maintain your behaviors, and even analyze like memes and trends you get caught up on, and be able to say to yourself, like, why am I getting sucked into this? Why am I getting attracted to this? And that's a very, very fascinating question. And like, in order to remain objective with this, a blunt denial, I'm not sure is the right idea. It's about sort of saying to yourself, how do I relate to this stuff, I think is the correct thing. Like, how do I interact with this so that it can be a boon to my life and I can minimize the downsides? That's really where I think the rubber hits the road.
So I think all of this said, my real final question is this. If the ideology that made Rome what it was, that might is right and violence is key, and then that same violence essentially ushered in the era of slave morality and ethics, as Nietzsche would call it, what will the age of ethics and slave morality usher in inside of this new age of AI that we're entering into?
So that's a very interesting question. And I think, like, again, I'm a bit caught because I see these two different directions it could be. Like, are we in a historical process of progress? That's a very important question to ask, because that's the sort of Jungian theory, and it kind of comes with Hegel and Marx as well. And that's the idea that we're moving towards something. And I think an awful lot of like the technologists are caught up in this, that we're accelerating towards a sort of like end goal where we're going to escape velocity, the past. History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awaken. So first, that's the predicate of what you're asking there, because you're saying that like we went from master morality to slave morality, and then we're going to go towards a new morality, a reevaluation of values. So there kind of has to be an implicit progress there for that to make sense. Like the other option is, as I said, it's like almost like a pagan return, like traditionalism. Like this is just a bubble of delusion. It's almost like the last 2,000 years have been a bit of a psychotic break, and then we're going to come back to nature. So mass morality was not some intellectual category, but it was the natural morality, the way the world works. It was the natural orientation of nature, the law of the lions, and we entered into these advanced civilizations, and we exited that. We went out of that, and we went into this sort of new abstract morality, and it was a side quest for 2,500 years, and we're just going to default back to that again. And maybe we'll do it with technology, but you could also see people like completely banning technology. Like, for example, Dune. What happens in Dune? There's a Butlerian jihad. They hugely restrict technology and become hyper-religious. And they live on Mars trying to, get the spices so that they become wealthy. So it's interesting that there's a much more pessimistic attitude towards technology there, and it is a bit of a return to nature. And what you're seeing in Dune is guys like fighting in sword battles and stuff like this. So it's a return back to the medieval world, if you will, and probably a return back then to honor, and a return back to like extreme religiousness and stuff like this. So that's one possibility. Possibilities are the name of the game here. Now, if we were to think of this idea that maybe I'm proposing with Jung, that this does turn out to be a real thing, and we become permanently integrated with technological tools, and there is no collapse and all this type of stuff, and mankind goes forward into this sort of, we start sellotaping these things inside of our heads and all this. I think the limits to that, like the whole idea of ethics or morality as we understood it before, like this is going to just become so far out of our perceptual horizon, it's going to be crazy. Because if Neuralink actually can do what it proposes it can do, you're going to get things where people can like cognitively enhance themselves. Now that's not the same as like you're not dealing with people there anymore. This is Nietzsche's Übermensch territory. This is the idea that we've gone beyond mankind. You plug in a Neuralink, and if it gives you the capacity to add a robotic arm, which it can do, by the way, already, that gives you superhuman strength, you're dealing with something that's not necessarily human. If you can go in and you can do a surgery where you put a Neuralink into your brain, and the Neuralink can then store your memories and create an infinite memory filing cabinet that you can bring back out, like that's not the same as a normal person. If they get to the point where it can enhance IQ, if we combine this with CRISPR genetic engineering techniques, like all of a sudden now we're not in the same ballpark at all as we were before. We're in a completely different sense. What happens if they can start to replace organs or grow new organs, or things start to get so crazy? And so at that point, you'll have a people, maybe the people who will embrace this, if things work out this way, who will start to become so much more beyond man that they'll essentially become too powerful to get shackled by things like ethics. Like this is very similar to what happened in medieval Europe. Like even though it was the era of Christianity, it's not like the natural order went away. It's just that at the very, very like big perspective, these little subtle changes in the conscience had huge effects. But all throughout medieval Europe, there was a lot of might is right is going on. And the best example of this is the hereditary Germanic knights. They essentially appeared as terminators. Like how did they appear to the average peasant? The peasant had no military training. The peasant had no understanding of who he was because there's no memory, there's no writing in the family. The peasant was probably frail from eating grains and stuff. The peasant had no money to buy like advanced armor. The peasant didn't have a horse. Now he would come across in this instance a character who was a Germanic Goth whose forefathers had won a position of the royal caste of Europe during the fall of Rome. His father bravely fought with Alaric or something like this and won a castle and became like one of the quote unquote aristocratic elites. And he would have meat his whole life, so he'd be much bigger and much more powerful. He would have been taller. He would have been literate, so he'd have an understanding of his ancestry and who he was. So he'd literally have like sort of like a destiny. He'd have wealth, so he'd have armor. He'd have military training from youth. He'd have a horse. And if this character showed up to a peasant, it's almost like a god. It's like nearly like a different species in some sense in his relative power. So there's a sort of like there would have been Ubermensch impressions there, if you want to say. This guy seems like he's beyond me, and he in some weird sense could almost do anything to you he wanted to because he's so powerful relative to you. Now this is where we look at maybe it's a nerd fantasy, but is that what's coming now with technology? Are we in this situation where you're going to have Bezos and he's going to start to augment himself and increase his IQ? Like what happens when some of these dudes like Brian Johnson get together with these Neuralink guys and they increase their memory capacity, their IQ, their capacity to speak. They get robotic strength. They replace organs. They biohack. They use all these peptides. And all of a sudden they're living to 160 years on average. And the average person is eating fast food, getting addicted to the phone, not having clean and clever marriage, not being smart with their marriages. And they start to this and they live like 60 years. And they're now like they're at a different pace of life than these super people. And that split begins to happen. These people who live 160 years gather assets. Imagine how much Bitcoin you could stack over the course of 160 years if you're diligent about it. Compared to these people who are imprudent, they have like a couple of kids and then they get addicted to Netflix and they start to descend down. And so there's this sort of bifurcation of mankind that takes place. And like, we think about morality in that situation. It's kind of hard to know. Like these people will be essentially aristocrats. They're going to be different is all I can really tell you. And I guess the main question would be more like, what would be the sort of style of our society? Like, will technology persist and will it turn into this thing where we'll have this sort of broad, worldwide, decentralized Bitcoin ledgers with electricity all across the world, people using like solar panels or maybe nuclear power. And then we have these special people who can move around the world and they're super powerful and they live much longer than everybody else. And it sort of creates this sort of new society that we live in that's integrated with technology where we have this augmented powers that are going like all this could happen. And it's fascinating to ponder. And I guess the main thing is not necessarily the formal ethics because people get caught up in that an awful lot, formal declarative morality, but more so like how it's going to affect us, what it's going to make us. The Roman era to the Christian era was a transformation in our conscience. People think it was about banging the Bible on your head, but that's not it. It's the fact that there was a trigger inside of the European mind from then on out that made them doubt their instincts and favor idealism. That's not morality per se. Morality is a part of that, but it's like that psychological difference is what made all the difference. Then coming into our era, this new psychology, that's the big thing that Jung's talking about, is the plugging in of the machine into the mind. And that's where things become interesting. So hopefully that made some sense. Hopefully the audience is hyped and all that, brushing off their old knights in shining armor so they can be members of the new royal aristocracy of the techno Iron Men.
Yeah, I'm going to go dust off my sword right now. Uberboyo, where can people find you?
You can check me out on YouTube, of course, alongside Mr. Anti.Prophet up here on YouTube. I'm on TikTok. I'm on X, on all of those. So if you're interested in popping into that, check me out. Give a listen to some of my long tirades on this stuff. I'd be happy to have you.
Uber Boyo, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. And I guess one last thing I'd say is that there is, for all the boyos who might be listening, this is Mr. Anti.Prophet. I highly recommend you check him out as well. He's a good chap, and he talks about an awful lot of this stuff. He's been asking me questions, but he actually discusses many of these things himself. You know, he's playing maybe a little bit of the questioner without the opinion, but he's actually hit on an awful lot of these motifs himself. And he's on TikTok, he's on YouTube, so I recommend you give him a look.
All right, everyone. Stay frosty. We'll see you next time.